everybody. Well, we're going to finish up our talks about angiosperms by today discussing their flowers. We'll get a little more detailed about the flowers themselves, how they're pollinated, and then once they're pollinated and the seeds begin to develop, we'll also look at seed dispersal as well, and we'll learn a little bit about the animals that help with both pollination and seed dispersal. So in this presentation, the slides are a little bit small, so I'm going to go ahead and do most of this video just showing you the slides. We'll blow those up so you're able to see everything, just like this. All right, so you can see here, angiosperms, there's over 300,000 species of angiosperms. They're the most widely distributed of plant groups, and they're the most successful. You can see on this graph here that we have the other vascular seed plants and non-seed plants, including the ferns there. And you can see that they've all pollinated land and they've done quite well. But it was the angiosperms that really took off. Here you can see on the slide just a reminder of some of the adaptations of angiosperms. But taking off like this, it was really due to several key innovations. And so one of the main innovations that really helped angiosperms be successful are their flowers. Flowers are the organs for sexual reproduction. And so we're going to look a little bit more at those. And we mentioned a little bit in an earlier video that the flowers help aid in pollination as well. And so all of the adaptations we're going to see today is really helping the pollen of one species get to the pollen of that same species and not really waste it, as can happen with the gymnosperms. Recall that with gymnosperms, they also use pollen for reproduction or to spread sperm to other individuals, but that's just done by the wind. And so that pollen can land anywhere. So we'll see that the flowers of angiosperms has really helped the pollen to be targeted and reach the individuals of the same species. Also in that same vein, angiosperms have seeds and fruit. The fruit then protects the seed. And so there's a lot of protection, added protection for the seeds, but then it also aids in dispersal as well. We, along with many other animals, we love to eat fruit. And so because of that, we take a piece of fruit and we move away from the parent plant. So that can be an adaptation, a very successful adaptation as well. Within each seed is a nutritive substance referred to as endosperm. And so this is nourishment to help the growing embryo, really helps with germination and boosts the successfulness of germination. And then in the vessels and the xylem and phloem, the conducting cells, they also have vessel elements in the xylem, which are much more efficient at moving water than some of the other ones are. So than the tracheids of the other plants. All right, so we're going to go through, look at mainly 1 through 3 of these, and we're going to discover what makes angiosperms so successful. Okay, so here we've seen this before, so let's kind of go over it again. This is the morphology of a flower. Morphology means the physical characteristics of a flower. So starting at the bottom, you see the peduncle, and that's at the end of the stem, and that supports the receptacle above, and then this is where the flower rests on top of that. From there, the flower, its main organs that we see are petals, and the petals are the colored portion to be able to attract different pollinators, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. They might actually even produce an odor. And then protecting those petals are the sepals below. Together, the sepals and the petals make up the organ, the perianth. And then on the inside of the flower are the sexually reproducing organs. So right up through the middle, it looks like a vase. That is the female organ. That's known as the pistil. And the pistil then contains the ovary at the base, and this is where the eggs are going to be contained, and then later the seeds will develop there, and the whole thing will actually become the fruit. And so in order to get the be able to be fertilized, there needs to be a pathway down to that area, and that's the other two portions above. So the stigma is at the very top of the pistil, and that's the sticky portion that pollen can stick to. And then once pollen does stick to it, it will digest a pathway down through the style, forming a tube into the ovary itself. So we mentioned pollen. That comes from the male portions of the plant called the stamen. And the stamen is separated into the two portions there. The filament is just the stalk that holds the anther on top. And the anther is the compartment where pollen is actually made. So in different species of plants, the stamen, the filament actually can be different lengths. Again, depending on that has changed over time with the coevolution of different pollinators. They also, in the female and the pistil, the style can also be of different lengths as well. So we'll see some examples of that a little bit later. So again, 4 main types of organs in a flower, and those are the sepals, the petals, the stamens, and the carpels, which again, one or more is actually forming the pistil that we mentioned. This picture kind of shows the same thing, shows a little bit of a different flower, but you can see a little different arrangement of petals and anthers in the pistil as well. But I just want to mention, just to carry on what we learned about previous types of plants, is that it's the stamen where the microspores are produced, microspores, and it's down within the carpel that contains the megaspores. Okay, and so again, the megaspores will be within the ovule, will be the ovule. Okay, so a flower itself can be very diverse, not only in its look, but also which parts that it actually contains. So we refer to those as either complete flowers or incomplete flowers. A complete flower just has the 4 main flower parts listed there. Again, the sepals, the petals, the stamen, and the carpel. An incomplete flower then would be missing one or more of those parts. And so in the picture over on the right, you can see that that flower is missing the male portions, the filament and the anther or the stamen altogether. It doesn't always have to be one of the reproductive parts, just one of these 4 or more could be missing to be calling it an incomplete flower. So make sure you can just tell the difference between a complete flower and an incomplete flower. Just remember those 4 main parts. Okay. If it's really just the sexual reproductive organs that are missing, that's the difference between a perfect flower and an imperfect flower. So a perfect flower has both of the sexes. They have both the stamens and the pistil. And I see a typo there, stames, that should have an N in there, S-T-A-M-E-N-S. Okay, and so this is a plant that has both of the sexes, and refer to that as monoecious because it is also complete and it has both of the sexes there, monoecious. So one flower, mono means one is containing both of the sexes. The one below is considered an imperfect flower because it's lacking either the pistils or the stamens, right? We refer to that type of a flower as dioecious because you're going to need 2 flower types. Di means 2. So we refer to it as dioecious because you need 2 different flower types in order for those plants to be able to reproduce. Okay, and that happens in plants such as corn and in melons. There's a lot of other examples as well. Okay, and so here's kind of a close-up into the male and female portions of the plant, so you can look at the development of the female and the male gametophytes. So in alternation of generations in the flowering plants, the female and the male gametophytes are microscopic. And so they are nutritionally dependent on the sporophyte. So they cannot exist without the sporophyte. So this kind of completes our endpoint of plants so far, at least, with the alternation of generations. We went from bryophytes having the dominant gametophyte stage with a dependent sporophyte, and now we've done a complete reversal. And again, that's going to help with the adaptation onto dry land. So looking at this picture, if we go down the column toward the left side, this is the pathway for the female organs. So you have the ovule at the base, that's the megasporangium, and inside of there is a megasporocyte. So that's the cell, that's the diploid cell inside of the megasporangium that's going to divide by meiosis. So when there's a cell division by meiosis, we know that means that the chromosome number in that megasporocyte is going to be cut in half. Okay, and so that's what happens here. In meiosis, please review the video that was posted to you on Canvas if you are still struggling with the difference between cell divisions of meiosis and mitosis. But in meiosis, you always start with a diploid single cell. That cell goes through one cell division, which means it divides into two. And during that cell division, each cell gets a haploid number of chromosomes. So we already cut the number of chromosomes in half for each of the new cells. But then there is a second division of each of those two cells, and each of those divide also into two. But they maintain the number of chromosomes, so they all end up being haploid as well. Okay, so from one megasporocyte, we end up getting 4 megaspores. But you can see from the picture there, only one of the megaspores continues on, it's functional. The other 3 disintegrate. And before they disintegrate, when that process is occurring, all the nutritional portions of the cell, all the cell machinery, it gets packed into that one megaspore. So the one megaspore is actually getting more of the components that it would get in a regular cell division. But then that megaspore can divide by mitosis. So remember that mitosis is a type of cell division that always maintains the number of chromosomes. It's not about cutting the number of chromosomes in half. So this megaspore is already haploid because it was produced from the megasporocyte by meiosis, so it's haploid. So that goes through cell division. So the megaspore, one cell divides into 2. But it says here that 3 divisions occur, so each of those cells end up dividing. And then you can see at the bottom there all of the different cells that are produced from the several mitotic cell divisions that occur. So what's important here to remember is that you do get a functional egg. One of those cells at the bottom is an egg. The other cell is the result of 2 cells fusing together, and so it gets 2 nuclei. And that's what's pointed out there as the polar nuclei in a central cell. So that cell is actually 2N diploid. The egg is 1N haploid. So those are things you really want to remember, because when we talk about then fertilization, that's going to have consequences for fertilization. Okay, so after the megaspore divides by mitosis, you can see that that becomes the female gametophyte. Okay, the embryo sac that contains the cells that we're interested in there. Going over on the right side of the plant, that's showing the pathway that the male portion of the plant takes. And so you can see they cut open the anther, so you can look inside there at the pollen sac. And inside of the pollen sac has the many microsporocytes. Microsporocyte. Incidentally, the term in biology CYTE, site, refers to cell. So these are referring to cells. So a microsporocyte is also 2N. It divides by meiosis. And like I said before, just like we saw on the female side, one 2N cell will divide by meiosis, producing 4 haploid cells. And that's what you see microspores for. It means there's 4 of them there. Only one for us. This is happening to produce a single pollen grain, so only one of those single microspores then will divide by mitosis, and so one cell divides into 2. So we end up, the end result is 2 sperm cells. Okay, so that forms the pollen grain, and the pollen grain itself is an immature male gametophyte. Alrighty, so just remember that process, because now we're going to look at what happens in the process of pollination, getting the pollen over to the female portion, over to the female gametophyte. All right, and that's pollination. So one of the things that we'll look at with pollination is that there's 2 types of pollination. One is self-pollination. That's when there's pollination within the same flower, or it could be different flowers of the same plant. Okay, but cross-pollination then occurs when pollen is transferred to a flower of the same species, but it's on a different plant. So you can see with cross-pollination, we're going to get a much more readily mixed set of genes if we do it that way. Okay, so pollinators do end up fostering genetic variability in a plant, and also the potential for evolutionary change. Remember, the more variability we get, then we're able to get the more potential for evolutionary change. Make that link back to our subject on population genetics. Okay, and so we see that pollination can occur in many different ways. And again, it's most advantageous if a plant is able to prevent self-pollination. Okay, so pollination, again, the definition is there, the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. And again, these plants would be more successful if they can prevent self-pollination. And they do that in many ways. So we've already seen that plants can have separate male and female flowers, and even the whole plant. There can be a female plant that only has female flowers on them, and another plant can have the male flowers on them. Some of them have both male and female flowers, but they may open and bloom at separate times. Okay? If they have both the male and the female flowers, they can actually shed the flower before the stigma is able to be shed the pollen before the stigma is able to be receptive to it. So again, it's a timing thing, getting the pollen out there before the stigmas are able to receive it. Okay. And then self-incompatibility. Sometimes the pollen is not effective at fertilizing the same flower, and that might have to do because of the genes being too similar. Okay, but one of the most fascinating things that happens is that flowers have developed to attract specific pollinators. Okay, and so pollinators, these are animal pollinators. They could be insects, they could be birds. We've even got some mammals that do it. They might show constancy or fidelity to particular flowers. That just means that they learn the flower characteristics and they visit them preferentially. And so you can see that where that would be an advantage for the plant, because then the same pollinator would be visiting the same species of plant. So therefore, it would have a limited species of pollen on its body, and ideally only one species of pollen on its body. So then it would make sure it would get that pollen to the appropriate plant. Okay, and how do they do that? They're going to attract the appropriate pollinator by using attractive colors, odors, shapes, sizes. And so on the table here, you can see, for example, bees, they are better at seeing yellows and blues and purples. So there are flowers that have really enhanced their color with yellow, blues, and purples. Those that found more success with bees pollinating the plant. Okay, and again, how would that happen? How does the flower know? It doesn't have to know, but just that if bees were in the area and doing a really good job at pollinating that plant, probably because it saw it and it was either more yellow or more purple or more blue than other individuals in the population, well, then of course, if the pollination occurred more readily, then the flower that was that color would be able to pass that gene on. And you would then again start to see that spread through the population. So again, don't forget what you've been learning in previous lectures on population biology as well. Okay, butterflies tend to like red and pink. Moths are attracted more to white flowers, and that's mostly because moths come out at night. Okay, you can see scent. Scent may also change with different pollinators. Why would a pollinator even come to the flower? Well, because the flower is offering some type of reward. Many of them offer a sweet, sugary substance called nectar. And so that is going to power and provide energy to the pollinator. Some eat some of the pollen itself. Well, isn't that a waste? Not necessarily, because plants can make a lot of pollen. And so they can afford to lose some pollen in order to ensure that the rest of their pollen gets distributed to other individuals of their species. Right? And again, the timing of the flowering could be very important. I mentioned moths tend to come out at night, and so the flower will stay closed during the day and open up about dusk. That's when the sun's going down, and then into the nighttime. Okay, and again, you can read the table with some of the other pollinators there. Okay, so about 70% of plants are pollinated by insects, and so the others, it's distributed between birds and mammals. Mammals mainly are the bats, but approximately 30% of our food crops is pollinated by bees. So this is one reason why we're very concerned with colony collapse disorder and diseases that are harming our bees, because it can really harm our food crops and do a lot of damage to the distribution of the food that we eat. So we got to protect our bees. Okay, so with this idea of then flowers kind of changing to be able to attract pollinators, that process is referred to as coevolution. So in coevolution, two or more species of organisms influence each other's evolutionary pathway. Okay? And it's usually beneficial to both, but it could be it can also not necessarily benefit both. This picture here is an example of an orchid that developed flower parts that mimic the female flower parts of a wasp. And so here you can see this male wasp, he actually thinks that he's mating with a female. And so he's wasting his time. It's not beneficial to the wasp, right? And so what can happen is that kind of an evolutionary arms race occurs. So here you can see that the orchid, in order to attract more male wasps, and maybe the whole reason the wasp in the first place was attracted to the orchid is that the odor that it produced kind of was similar to the odor that a female wasp will produce in order to attract males. We call those pheromones. And if they're attracting males for sexual reproductive purposes, we refer to those as sex pheromones. So the orchids then that had some success and had more offspring because the males wasps then pollinated their plants, those new offspring plants might have a stronger odor for the sex pheromone and might be a little more similar to the female wasp. And so you can see that down the road that may happen. So the male tracks the odor to the orchid, and he tries to pick up the petal, and thinking it's a female wasp. And you can see in this picture above the male wasp up there, just the orchid, one of the flowers that's plain. It really does kind of look like a female receptive to be mating with. And so when he tries to pick up the petal, he transfers pollen to another plant as he gets fooled again. But I mentioned that it's almost a coevolution arms race, because what we've noticed is that once a male wasp visits one flower, he doesn't get fooled again by that same flower. And so he may not come back to it. But then over time, we'll see that the orchid might produce an even stronger odor for the pheromone. And so it just kind of goes back and forth. But this coevolution with animals is a major evolutionary force with between mainly insects and flowers. And it's really the best explanation for the diversity of forms of the many flowers and fruits that we have. It's a super effective means of pollination, and later on we'll also see the dispersal of seeds as well. Okay, so again, here's showing kind of the diversification of flowers depending on the pollinator. So you can see that butterfly may not be able to get any nectar from the hibiscus plant because of the different shape of it. And so it's going to stick to these other species of plants. But again, the changes in the flowers that we see, sometimes we see fusion of flower organs, changes in the symmetry of the flower, loss of certain flower organs, and that could happen to help accommodate the pollinator. Changes in the position of the organ, so that's why you see I mentioned the different sizes and shapes of the pistils and the stamens, so on and so forth. And so these flowers become specialized for a particular pollinator. And so we see this beautiful diversity of flowers, and again, that also helps with the success of the pollinator for the most part, especially when they're getting a treat like this, the nectar that this bee is getting. Okay? So the bee is pressing in to obtain the nectar, and look at how the stamens just spring out, and how they curl back along the back of the bee. Look at the bee's body is just peppered with pollen. And so again, it's going to end up going to a flower of the same species, and that pollen will then stick on the stigma that it comes across when it goes to pollen of the same species. Here's a swallowtail butterfly. This one is going after nectar, and this is a plant called a buttery weed flower. The butterflies see different colors, but they also very importantly need a place to land. And so you'll see that the flower accommodates that as well. This one is being pollinated by a beetle. This is called an Australian long-nosed lysid beetle. And it's obtaining nectar right now from an Australian tea tree. Okay? And again, look real closely on his back, all the little dots on there, that's the pollen, and there's pollen along his legs and things. So as he crawls around, he's going to pollinate that flower. This one is called, this is an interesting flower called a carrion flower. Carrion refers to as animals that have died and they're rotting out of there. That's what carrion is. And we know that there are certain animals like buzzards and things that eat carrion, and lots of different insects. And so this flower is attempting to attract flies to it in order to get pollinated. So it does that by emitting a really putrid scent. So that meaning a scent that smells like rotting flesh, and then the color also resembles dried blood. So the flies might think that they've landed on a piece of a dead animal that it would normally suck the juices from that are breaking down from that animal decomposing. Here we've seen one of these already. This is a hummingbird. This is called a broad-billed hummingbird, and it's getting nectar from a desert flower called the ocotillo in Arizona. And usually the flowers with hummingbirds, they have these long tubes. And so that's why the hummingbirds have a long beak in order to get down there. So the pollen grains on the bird's feathers then are just carried to the next plant. Flowers that are pollinated by hummingbirds are usually oranges, reds, yellows, and they tend to lack a scent because hummingbirds don't have a sense of smell. And so it doesn't makes sense then for the plant to waste energy on producing a scent because it's not doing them any good. Look at this one's pretty cool. So this is an orchid that mimics female bees, and so it ends up attracting the male bees again. And because the male bees think they're mating with female bees, they end up getting pollen all over them and spreading that pollen to the other orchids. Orchids are kind of deceptive. Beautiful, beautiful flowers, but boy, are they deceptive, at least to male wasps and bees. And the other thing that's interesting, when you look at a flower, we might just see that color, like this one's yellow, but because other animals can see UV radiation, like butterflies and like bees, they actually see something a little bit different. So this flower is an evening primrose, and so under UV radiation, again, that we can't see, but the other insects can, you can see kind of a bullseye in the middle. So it kind of directs that pollinator toward the center where the nectar is, and then the pollen grains will be too. I think I put on Canvas some links to some videos so that you can see what flowers look like under, all different types of flowers, what they look like under UV radiation. It's pretty interesting. And then here's a bat. This is a lesser long-nosed bat, and it's pollinating the flower of a cactus. It's called a Cadon cactus. And so you can see the flower has a big wide opening so the bat can insert his head in there, going down to get the nectar, and when he pulls his head out, he'll have all that yellow pollen dusted all over him. And a white flower, because white bats are out at night, so you don't have the radiation from the sun for the colors to pop out. So this idea of coevolution was predicted by Charles Darwin, and you can see he wrote a paper on this back in 1862. The various contrivances by which British and foreign orchids are fertilized by insects. And so what he did, I mentioned to you guys before this in class, is that he noticed there was an orchid with a 13-inch long pollen tube or nectar tube. So he predicted, well, most of these orchids are pollinated by moths, so there must be a moth out there with a 13-inch long tongue. And sure enough, it was discovered in 1903. They did discover that. And so over there on the right side, you'll see a South African orchid and a pollinator, it's fly pollinator, with its really long tongue. Okay, so pollen gets transferred to the stigma of a flower, and so now we can see what happens. So the action of pollination is that pollen being transferred to the female portion of the flower, and that's what you see in number 1. The pollen grain sticks to the stigma, and you can see as we look at number 2, you get a little close-up view, then the pollen, one of the cells in there begins to secrete enzymes that digest the flesh or the tissues down the style, creating a tube. And so remember, there are 2 sperm cells in there. Those 2 sperm travel down the pollen tube to get to the opening of the ovary, getting access to the ovule. And remember, it's the ovule that contains the female gametophyte. And that female gametophyte has the egg along with the 2 polar nuclei. So one of the sperm cells fertilizes the egg. Now we're into fertilization. Again, fertilization is when the sperm penetrates into the cell membrane of the egg, and then their 2 nuclei fuse. So we get a 2N or a diploid zygote. Okay? But the other sperm cell fertilizes the polar nuclei. So remember, there are 2 nuclei in there. The sperm has its own nucleus, so that's 3. So that becomes a triploid cell, and that triploid cell makes the endosperm. And so recall that the endosperm becomes a tissue that is able to provide nutrients to the embryo when it is beginning to grow inside of there. So the ovules become the seeds, and we're going to see in a minute that the ovary becomes the fruit surrounding the seed. Okay, and so here's a nice picture showing that seed development. So now you can see the maturing embryo inside of there. And since this is a dicot, because there are 2 cotyledons in there. Remember, that was a characteristic of a dicot, 2 cotyledons. You can see the other portion of the embryo is going to become the stem and the root for the embryo. The kind of orangish yellowish tissue surrounding the embryo, that's the endosperm. And the endosperm begins to become more and more reduced as the embryo is maturing inside of the seed. But then there's a point where the maturation is arrested, it stops, and it goes into dormancy, and it won't continue until the seed is in an appropriate environment. And when it is, that means that that embryo now can germinate, and so the plant will grow out of the seed. Okay. Notice the other tissues there forming the seed coat, and so on and so forth. And here's what an actual seed looks like. This is a seed from a bean. And this has a single cotyledon, so this is a monocot. It has a seed coat. Actually, this is we only are looking at one of the cotyledons. This is a dicot. So it's seed coat, and one of its 2 cotyledons were removed. So now we're only seeing the inside, and it shows, again, the major portion there is the cotyledon. That means that is the first leaf that will develop. It shows then the radicle, the hypocotyl, and the remaining cotyledon. Those are going to become the stem, and then also the growth into the root once the seed germinates. Okay. And so all of that is happening in the seed itself, but then the ovary itself, you can see over there on the left side of the flower, you can see the 2 ovules that become the 2 seeds inside of there, and then the circular structure surrounding it is the ovary. And that kind of the brown fleshy color, if you follow that over, that's referred to as the floral tube. That is going to become the fleshy portion of the fruit itself. And so over on the right, that looks like that's a pear. And so you can see that becomes the fruit portion surrounding the seeds that are inside of there. Okay. So that's where we get the fruit. And again, we like the fruit. We'll eat the fruit fleshy part, and we'll spit the seeds out. And hopefully those seeds will land in an area where it can germinate and grow into a new plant. So plants invest energy into producing a lot of seeds. And so we'll see this as a theme throughout a lot of organisms, is they produce a lot of seeds and or eggs, depending on what we're talking about, which organism we're talking about. And so some organisms can afford to lose some of those, and then in order to ensure that other ones end up germinating or growing into offspring. Okay, and this is just for your information. So I threw some pictures of here of different flowers, and you can see the different parts labeled and the different arrangements of their ovules and ovaries, and that's what causes the variety of fruit that we have, all the different types of fruit that you see. Okay, so we've got a fruit and a seed now ready to go. So plants may have this juicy sweet fruit and with a small seed, and so that's ready to be carried away by a seed disperser, another animal. And so we do see some coevolution that occurs with seed dispersal. So again, it's both the plant and the animal may co-evolve with this. Their body shapes and things might change depending on who is more successful with either spreading the seed or obtaining that seed as nutrition. Okay, we already saw this when we looked at the Galapagos finches and the influence different seeds and how tough they are on beak size. And so we've seen that changes in beak size can occur within generations, just again as the seeds might change as well. Okay, and then even fruits might have different colors to signal ripeness. And again, think of that. We do that ourselves when you go to the grocery store and you're trying to pick a fruit. You're looking at the color to determine, is this ripe or not? So does that mean that it's going to be sweet enough for us to eat? And that might indicate the development of the seed on the inside as well. So not only animals disperse seeds, wind and water can also disperse seeds as well, and that can influence the seed. So think of a big coconut and how, if you've ever tried to open a coconut, it's so hard to do. It's got the thickest seed coat, but that's because coconuts may be floating in the ocean for days or weeks. And you can't have, the salt water can break down the seed coat. So if it's too thin, it would break it down too early before it was able to wash up on land. So this way, that thick seed coat protects it from the salt water. And here are different types of seeds. So I mentioned wind and water. So that first one, the feathery plumes of a milkweed. So some seeds get these little cottony plumes on them and the wind can carry them away. Some have little spikes on them and that gets stuck on the fur of an animal or your clothing. And as you're walking through, you pick up a seed and you walk to a different area of the environment and it dislodges itself. And again, seed dispersal, being able to disperse itself. Some have little papery films on them, so they can also get picked up by the wind. And then there you see a little mouse there eating a fruit, and it might ingest some of the fruit and pass through its digestive system, and that helps to break down seed coats as well. And then being pooped out in a nice pile of poop, that's fertilizer. That's great for seeds. These seeds actually pop, and so have this little explosion that pushes the seeds out away from the parent plant by force. Okay, that's it for pollination and seed dispersal. I hope you enjoyed learning about plants and you can appreciate them a little bit more. All right, thank you everybody.